The Renaissance represented a time of reconstruction for cultural and artistic development in Europe as it made its recovery from the Dark Ages. The Renaissance began for three major reasons. One, during the Crusades, Christian soldiers in the Middle East saw Asian goods, which were being transported to the Middle East, and so they brought these goods home, causing the Europeans to initiate trade with the Muslims. Since the Crusades were launched from and returned to Italy, it was the Italian states who were the first European countries to get a taste of Asian goods, and they quickly capitalized. The second reason is the rise of the Ottoman Empire. This new Islamic Turkish empire conquered parts of the Balkans, pushing Greek philosophers to Italy, where they brought all of their scriptures. Their ideas and philosophies mixed in with those of the Italians, kicking off a new age of learning. The third reason was the Black Plague. This plague started in China, reaching Europe through trade in the early 1300s, and it eventually wiped out a third of Europe's population. The death toll was appalling to the religious population of Europe, who could not conceive that a plague could kill so many. The result was a major loss in faith and religion, and as mentioned in the previous video, peasants revolted against feudal lords. This was due to the economic instability brought by the plague and led to peasants demanding higher wages. So what did Italy look like at this time? Italy was comprised of a bunch of independent states, the main ones being Florence, Venice, and the Papal States. In Florence, the powerful Medici family reigned supreme. They became the main bankers of Europe and played a major part in the wool and mining industries of Florence. Next is Venice. As mentioned earlier, Venice was heavily involved in trading within the Mediterranean, building a wealthy commercial empire and being ruled by merchant aristocrats. And finally, the Papal States, which was a territory in Central Europe, ruled directly by the Pope, who was very influential in European politics at the time. Other Italian states included Naples, a corrupt kingdom which was torn apart by rebellious nobles, Milan, a dictatorship run by the Visconti and Sforza families, and Genoa, another commercial empire like Venice. A lack of cooperation between the Italian states allowed for external powers such as France and Spain to constantly invade and exploit the peninsula. Now let's talk about the social changes brought by the Renaissance. At first, the social structure of the Renaissance remained roughly the same as it was during the Middle Ages. There was the clergy, the nobility, and the peasantry, along with the bourgeoisie, who lived in cities and relied on their kings. There were also African slaves, whom the Arabs in North Africa bought from the African kingdoms south of the Sahara Desert. However, slavery in Europe declined around the 1400s, only to be re-established with the triangular trade around the 1500s, but that's a topic for a different video. Anyway, the Renaissance mostly affected the nobility, who dominated their respective countries, having much control over the kings and central governments. However, the nobility made most of its money by taxing the peasants, so at the end of the Middle Ages, this no longer worked, since the peasants had no cash and were dying from the Black Plague. Because of this, the nobility had to move on to other industries, such as trade. So let's talk about several of the principles introduced in the Renaissance. First, there was individualism, which celebrated everybody's uniqueness, highlighting the importance of each person. Another major principle was secularism. Now, a common misconception about secularism is that it was completely against any religious beliefs, and that it dictated that one should not believe in a religion, instead basing all beliefs on rational thought. Instead, it dictates that one should use rational thought, not just religious thought, when making a decision or philosophizing. And then there's humanism, the most important of the bunch. Humanism was an intellectual movement based on Greco-Roman literary works. Humanism revived subjects such as grammar, public speaking, poetry, philosophy, ethics, and history. It encouraged people to learn about and focus on these subjects to make themselves more intelligent and morally correct people. The founder of Italian humanism was a Florentine writer called Petrarch, who lived from 1304 to 1374. A subsection of humanism was civic humanism. Civic humanism was essentially humanism, except it also said that one should use positive qualities to help fellow humans and one's country. It also included using politics for the improvement of society in these ways. The arts were a massive part of the cultural movement in the Renaissance. Famous Renaissance writers include William Shakespeare, who wrote famous plays such as Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. Another writer was Niccolo Machiavelli, who established the Machiavellian way by writing a book called The Prince, in which he described his beliefs of how a ruler or leader should act. By following the Machiavellian way, a ruler would be feared, but simultaneously respected and admired. The leader would benefit the state by establishing control by any means necessary, and should be effective and decisive. Machiavelli also called for a unified Italy and the restoration of the Roman Empire. Renaissance artists include Leonardo da Vinci, who painted the Mona Lisa, and Michelangelo, a famed sculptor. Thanks to the Renaissance ideas of more unified and centralized countries, by the late 1400s, most kingdoms in Western Europe, mainly France, England, and Spain, had been fully centralized under the monarchs. In France, the Hundred Years' War, fought from 1337 to 1453, left France with a strong national consciousness. During the war, the French monarch strengthened the power of his position in order to fight the English. He did this by creating a royal army and banning any private armies of the nobles. He also raised a tax on the nobles' property, growing and gaining him control over the royal treasury. Because of this, France emerged from the Hundred Years' War a more centralized state. From 1455 to 1487, England took part in a war of succession called the War of the Roses, just like France did before it. This war pitted the House of York, the ruling dynasty, against the House of Lancaster. The War of the Roses was won by Henry Tudor from the House of Lancaster, who started the Tudor dynasty, crowning himself Henry VII. Henry gained control over the nobility in a more tyrant-like way. Like the French, he banned private armies and stated that only the king can raise an army for a specific campaign, but after the campaign is over, the army must be disbanded. He set up a court called the Court of the Star Chamber to control corrupt and irresponsible lords. There was no jury and torture was very common. While England and France obtained unification through war, Spain obtained unification through marriage and just a little bit of war. In 1469, Queen Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand, the King of Aragon. Ferdinand and Isabella removed all nobility from the royal council and replaced them with bureaucrats who were loyal only to the monarchy. Like France, they established a royal army, which would become the best in Europe by the 1500s. Instead of battling papal power in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella harnessed it. They established good relations with the Pope, making papal power an extension of their own, and starting the Spanish Inquisition to persecute Jews, Muslims, and anyone who denied papal authority. The best example of a state that failed to unify is the Holy Roman Empire. The largest landowning family in the Holy Roman Empire was the Habsburgs, who ruled over Austria. Over time, they would add territories to Austria through war and marriage. Emperor Maximilian I would try to unify the empire, but he failed, mainly because of independent German princes who didn't want to give up said independence to the emperor. These German princes also didn't like how they had to give up money to the Italian Pope, further fueling their resistance against the emperor. Emperor Maximilian did manage to create a powerful Austria by marrying the Habsburgs into the Spanish and Burgundian royal lines. Kingdoms and states in Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, and Russia, also failed to unify because of feudal lords. The Renaissance would not stay in Italy for long, as it would soon spread into Northern Europe in the 1400s. Art rapidly developed in the Low Countries, with Johannes Vermeer being one of the best Dutch artists of his time. There were also many new inventions, such as the printing press, which would become extremely important later on. By the year 1500, Western European kingdoms were either already unified or in the process of unifying, and soon they would become the battlegrounds of the Protestant and Catholic worlds.